My old-fashioned use of paper doesn't correspond with the use of technology. I'll just see if this is working. There we go. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much. Lovely to see you all. Oh, no, go ahead. Oh, that's all right. So apologies in advance for those of you who are already very familiar with the monuments of Konya in the 13th century, but hopefully there'll be something of interest to some of you. And apologies for having lost my voice partly. So the period in which Mevlana lived in Konya saw a significant alteration in and expansion of the urban fabric of the city. The architectural aesthetic applied to the major monuments, many of which survive in albeit much altered states, also changed significantly. The period from 1228 to 1278 covers the period in which the lands of Rum and Konya especially were at the forefront of innovation in terms of architectural developments in the whole of the wider Iranian world, and set the tone for later developments across Iran and Central Asia. The period starts with the major reconstruction of key elements of infrastructure, including elements of the city walls that were damaged during the siege of the city in 1190 by the Frankish Knights of the Third Crusade, led by Frederick I, and ends with the proliferation of architectural patronage by the figures that came to prominence following the defeat of the Rum Seljuks at Koseidar, which we've just heard so much about, so I won't dwell on that. This period of transition from Rum Seljuk to Ilkhanid political dominance of the city saw a major shift, both in what was built and how it looked. As the backdrop for the scholarly and religious developments that occurred in the city, how it looked and how it changed so rapidly in the period from the first to the third quarter of the 13th century is of major significance and is the focus of this paper. Through a series of case studies, the shift from building predominantly unglazed monuments, often with extensive use of spolia in the early 13th century, to the use of extensive areas of glazed tile mosaic revetment by the latter decades of the century will be explored, as will the increasing use of tall minarets across the city during the period of study. In addition, there was a degree of urban expansion and proliferation of caravanserais in the immediate vicinity of the city. And it's important at this point to note that, as with much architectural history of the pre-modern era, it's primarily the elite monuments of fired brick and cut ashlar stone that are the focus of this paper, and the less durable vernacular architecture is not something that I'll be addressing. One of the first things to try and understand before looking at the changes that the fabric of the city experienced through the 13th century is, how can we best understand what the existing buildings that were in the city at the start of the century and that have survived in one form or another through to the present day actually look like? It's only once as clear a view as possible of the earlier phase of building emerges and how they were built and decorated that it's possible to try and evaluate the changes that occurred to the formal and decorative aesthetic throughout the course of the 13th century in Konya. And one building that can help reveal something about this earlier period is the easternmost of the pair of known towers built on top of two earlier bastions of the Byzantine citadel walls. Last comprehensively studied by Zara, and with a recent chapter by Chelebi on the excavations of the Western Tower, this kiosk is the focus of an ongoing project to try and reconstruct its original appearance that Patricia Blessing and myself are running. Some preliminary but by no means final renderings have been prepared based on the surviving evidence, and it's very much a work in progress, but I thought better to show you something than nothing. The surviving elements of the wall decoration do allow a conjectural reconstruction, showing that a design in red, white and yellow was used to transition from the ashlar stone base of it and the connecting walls between the two towers, and the brick hazarbaf or thousand weaving decoration of the balcony and supporting muqarnas bracket. And here you can just see a detail of the surviving decoration. Traces remain to show that the plaster served first on the lower section to imitate large ashlars, then on the upper section between the brackets to imitate the brick decoration, to act as a visual transition between these two primary construction materials of the building, and indeed much of the city beyond. Although the yellow still needs to be added, this draft rendering gives an idea of how the side and the balcony of the kiosk may have appeared in the early 13th century. And close study of the early photos in the corpus of tiles and other surviving media shows that there were multiple phases of decoration and other interventions over the long history of this building. This image of the Oban on the right shows the two possible phases of the spandrel decoration, with the colors suggested by Zara's observations of the site. Other key elements of the built environment that were recorded in the 19th century but now lost, including the city walls, and here's one of Laborde's famous images of part of that. There is further work required to gather all of the extant drawings, descriptions, as well as the archaeological reports that can allow for a more detailed reconstruction of certainly the external approach to the city as it appeared to visitors coming towards the city in the periods prior to the late 19th century. There was a huge amount of construction and restoration and reconstruction underway when Rumi arrived in Konya, but this was followed by something of a lull, partly but not totally due to the Seljuk defeat at Köseda. But subsequently, there was a significant increase in the development and construction in the city in the second half of the 13th century. And while, as Zara has actually just shown, it's possible to map known sites and get some sense of patterns of construction, the considerable and largely unknown losses do make it hard to know how much can be extrapolated from such a partial data set, not necessarily for the purposes you were doing, but for what I'm doing. The expansion of the city southwards is marked by the standing monuments, such as the artist formerly known as Sahib Atta. I think we've now decided he should just be called Sahib, but the Sahib complex. To the north of that, between there and the citadel, the huge excavation site to the east of the Sajala Madrasa has revealed not just a kiln, but numerous other structures, showing the extent of the urbanism in that area in the 13th century. The two earliest surviving mosques in Konya, the Iplukja and the Citadel or Al-Adin Jami, do not appear to have been built with minarets, although they do now feature later additions. There are traces of an earlier minaret found at the Iplukja, but it's not clear either how tall it was or indeed when it was actually built. So at the time Rumi arrived in Konya, there may well have been some minarets marking the city as a Muslim urban space, but it was through the decades that he lived there that they both proliferated and became increasingly attenuated. I'll just go into a bit of detail about three of these earlier 13th century minarets before moving on to the rather different styles employed later on. There's an array of different minaret shaft typologies built in Konya, and the Hatuniya in the center here, built in 1229 to 30, has this octagonal shaft, whereas the nearby Zemburi Jami minaret has an attenuated octagonal base that reaches the roofline of the mosque. This Zemburi has no epigraphy, but it appears to be a similar age to the Hatuniya based on the date range suggested by Michael Meinecke. The Hatuniya Jami minaret, also referred to as the Kutuk Minare, originally had a taller upper cylindrical shaft with a second balcony, according to a small sketch that survives from before its collapse. The top of the octagonal section has a band of glazed strapwork decoration below a band of shouldered arch blind panels. And this is sort of the level of glazed decoration that we tend to see in the earlier part of the 13th century. Little accents, small areas, but predominantly either brick on the minarets or stone on the lower structures, certainly on the exterior. The original mosque hasn't survived, so it's now a freestanding minaret, but it was originally attached to the north of a monument, and it has a stone inscription panel set into the west wall that gives the name of the ruling sultan, Al-Adin Kekubad, as well as the patron Haji Mahmud, and the year 627. So here we've got the same sort of model, large ashlars for the base and brick for the upper section, with a beveled edge on three sides that are not attached to the mosque. The Zemburi Mesjidi minaret, seen here on the right, features an octagonal tower and cylindrical upper brick shaft attached to the northwest corner of the mosque. There's a truncated cylindrical shaft with alternating full-size horizontal and short vertical bricks, which I don't know if you can really see it very well, but it does create this sort of herringbone hazarbaf pattern. And is stylistically datable to the first half of the 13th century, but that's fairly loose. The base of the minaret forms part of the wall that now creates an irregularly shaped base. So things vary. There's no consistency or standard approach seen. There's general styles, but there's a lot of variation between what does survive. And another short minaret from the same period is what seems a rather bulky one attached to the Hoja Hassan Masjidi. It has a unique form, which is essentially a square shaft with a half-width vertical rib on each facet. But the effect is actually more complex because it looks like it has, at the same time, both a square and a cylindrical shaft at the same time. There are two tiers of muqarna cells supporting the unusual shaped balcony with a band of glazed turquoise tiles below. And again, appears to be dating from the first half of the 13th century. So having seen these three, I think we could all agree, relatively unimpressive minarets, attention turns to one of the most striking minarets built in the whole of Anatolia in the 13th century. Originally much taller and always single, the minaret at the Inja Minari Madrasa has a shaft, sections of which are very similar in their surviving lower section to the ones at the paired Gök Madrasa minarets in Sivas. Both madrasas feature the signature of the same architect, Kaluk ibn Abdallah, and the main difference is the sections between the glazed ribs alternate between curved and flanged in the Konya example. Above the ribbed section of the shaft and below the balcony projection, there was a band of turquoise and black glazed tile mosaic, of which only very small fragments remain. And this minaret is datable to 1258 to 1278. But again, as we see in this earlier image from before 1900, it originally had a much taller, thinner shaft atop the first balcony, and then a third, shorter section above that. And if you just look at the photo on the left, it shows just how much Konya has changed. You know, the city stops not very far past the very center of what is now the citadel. But you can see the verticality projects this building far out into the distance, and it's something that you could be 20, 30 miles away from the city and start to see the presence of it. It projects the presence of the city so much further out into the surrounding landscape. This is not a particularly tall building without its minaret. You wouldn't really see it from within the built environment, but this increased verticality makes a huge difference to the appearance of the city from afar. The transition from the square base to the shaft is a particularly elegant solution which combines the corner triangles and an octagonal section at almost equal height. The black and turquoise sections between the vertical ribs are inserted into the rising joints between three different sizes of bricks. And the faces of these three brick sizes, 5 by 5, 10 by 5, and 20 by 5, provide the basis for the pattern that's inset there. Analysis of the lost section, which fell in 1901, shows the remaining portion of the shaft represents less than a third of the total height of the minaret, which is estimated to originally been approximately 55 meters high. The second section of the shaft was ribbed with small flanged sections in between, and this was a reversal of the form used for the lower section, the ribs featuring glazed intarsia, creating similar, if simpler patterns as seen on the surviving section. Above the second balcony, which was supported on three tiers of brick muqarnas, was the third section of the shaft, vertical ribs of the kind seen at the earlier Yivli minaret in Antalya, and also not entirely dissimilar to the form of the ruby turbe that we will, some of us will be seeing later today. This upper section also featured glazed intarsia, and the diagram at the bottom shows the three stages of the drawing. The final phase of Seljuk brick minaret decoration took place in the second half of the 13th century. I know it doesn't look like a paired minaret, but trust me, there were two there. This truncated twin gadroon shafts over entrance portal and additional greater use of glazed decoration. Built in 1258, this is the only surviving example of a mosque with twin minarets, or having had twin minarets. This combination of twinning and attenuation of minarets would have changed the skyline of the city and made a strong impression on people approaching it from a considerable distance away. Now, the closest thing that we have of a view of the city as Rumi knew it is this relatively large painting by Matrechki Nasu, completed in 1537 as an illustration to his book Mejmui Menazil. The overall accuracy of the image has been recently confirmed by cartographic analysis by Hussein Zahid Selvi and Gay Bekirolu Kesin in 2019, and it does appear to be a reliable source for the appearance of the city in the pre-modern age. It measures 40 by 60 centimeters and can be seen to be largely accurate, while, as you can see, still following the stylistic approaches of the genre. It shows the expansion of the city extramuros, and while it is from about 250 years after the death of Rumi, it's still a key document and a very useful overview of the city's appearance in the pre-modern era. The earliest surviving Islamic structures in Konya, such as the Iplikçe and Aladdin Jamis, do not appear to have made such conspicuous use of large domes with glazed decoration on the interior as the mid to later 13th century madrasas do. However, that former mosque, the Iplikçe, has been so heavily altered that it's hard to understand its original appearance, and it does appear to have had some sort of dome as late as the 19th century. It's only photographs from the outside that show it. But the type of large dome, such as this one here in the Büyük Karatay Madrasa, coupled with the extensive use of glazed tile mosaic revetments, highlight just one of the major changes to the architecture of the city that can be seen to have occurred during the period in which Mevlana resided there. Originally open to the sky at the apex, the combination of square Kufic inscriptions in the Turkish triangle pendentives, the knotted Kufic around the base and the upper opening of the dome, and the stellate decoration in between are all decorative elements seen before in the region. However, sheer volume and the encompassing area of glazed coverage is what sets it apart and mark a paradigm shift in the relationship between the decoration and the underlying construction material of buildings. Alongside the use of large domes with tile mosaic revetment, the standard 401 plan developed in Iran in the preceding centuries was adopted and adapted, with what was a courtyard now covered with the dome and the Awan becoming an internal space. The biggest, albeit still largely internal change to the architectural aesthetic of the city that the residents would have seen is this massive increase in the area of glazed tile used on buildings. It starts out relatively limited, perhaps with the exception of the roof of the dynastic tomb in the courtyard of the Citadel Mosque in the beginning of the century, but it really proliferates from the 1240s onwards. And while it's important to remember just how much the surviving buildings have changed and how many more have been lost, the evidence is still firmly on the side of there having been a major leap forward in the architecture of not just the city, but given what came afterwards, the architectural revetment and decoration in the wider Persianate world. In addition to the large domes, single large Iwans were used as an axial focus for buildings without the large dome in other structures from this period. Seen here, we see the Jalal Madrasa. There is greater use of black glazed tile mosaic over time, particularly using manganese oxide as a glazed colorant. And while the basic elements can again be seen in earlier monuments, the all-over decoration masking the areas of both brick and stone structure, as we can see here, where it's been removed, much of it ending up in Berlin, but that's another story, is an innovation of the region and period. It was one that was subsequently adopted to the east in Iran and Central Asia in the following period, once the Mongols had converted to Islam and the level of architectural patronage expanded, reaching its apogee under the Timurids. As I draw to a close, there's just one more element in the architectural aesthetic of Konya used during the period that Mevlana was resident in the city that I'd like to address. This motif that became associated with Konya and the Rum Seljuk dynasty more broadly is this geometric interlace, introduced to the city as a flat design in marble from the mihrabs of Syria, especially in Aleppo. It was externalized and monumentalized in the 1220s in Konya. There are two main examples. There's one here in the middle as the north entrance to the Citadel Mosque, and very familiar, I'm sure, to most of you. The other now accessing the later Büyük Karatay Madrasa just to the north. Both are large, flat, marble, and in prominent, highly visible locations. What can be seen to have occurred throughout the 13th century is that the primary corner knotting element became a separate motif, unrelated to the more complex meaning encoded within the whole original composition. It became a relief decorative motif seen on at least two monuments in the city and others far beyond, and in a variety of related compositions. I've recently written on this ornament and its use and development, and it was a project both funded and published by the BIAA. So I want to recognize that and say thank you, since I'm here. Thank you, there he is, as the representative. But I'm not going to dwell too much on the subject. But suffice to say, you can see that the interminare madrasa facade has a separated pair of these motifs, which here on the left. They're similar, but not identical. You've got these panels on the right that are at the Sahib portal at the south of the city. In both cases, they're still visible, but not on the same scale, and do not dominate the structure in the same way as the earlier examples. The design has gone from being the queen of all it surveys to little more than the handmaiden of the tiles and other carved lithic decoration in relief. Overall, the half century from the 1220s to the 1270s saw a shift from primarily imperial patronage and the city being a Seljuk capital of an empire to being just one of several Ilkhanid controlled centers with a far more diverse range of patrons. These individuals constructed new madrasas and tombs across the city and beyond the walls, using the pre-existing materials and motifs, but combined in new and innovative ways, and with far greater internal coverage of the walls with glazed tile mosaic than ever had been seen before. Thank you.